The rain hammered down on the sleek, silver Bentley as it idled at a red light, its engine purring like a caged beast. Inside, Jackson Reed gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening against the polished leather. His jaw clenched as he stared out at the blurred cityscape of Chicago, the neon lights smearing into streaks of color through the storm. At 38, he was the youngest billionaire in the Midwest, the iron-fisted CEO of Reed Innovations, a tech empire that dominated the skyline with its glass and steel headquarters. He had everything: money that flowed like water, influence that bent politicians to his will, a name that made people straighten their spines when it was uttered. But tonight, as the thunder growled overhead, a hollow ache gnawed at him. Was any of it real? Did anyone actually give a damn about him? Or was it all just a performance for the power he wielded? The light turned green, and he floored the gas. The car surging forward as if it could outrun the question burning in his chest. By the time he reached his penthouse on the 60th floor, the storm had worsened, sheets of rain battering the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city like a living painting. Jackson tossed his soaked trench coat over a chair, the Armani fabric crumpling carelessly, and poured himself a glass of bourbon. The amber liquid glowed in the dim light as he sank into a leather sofa, his dark brown eyes tracing the jagged lightning outside. He was alone, always alone, despite the crowds that flocked to him at galeas and board meetings. The realization hit him like a punch. He'd spent years building a fortress of wealth, but it was a prison. If were too. Everyone wanted something: his approval, his investment, his name on their resume. But who would stick around if it all vanished? The bourbon burned his throat as he took a long sip. And then, in a flash of reckless clarity, an idea sparked. He'd find out. He'd strip it all away, just for a day, and see who cared when he was nothing but a nobody. The next morning, Jackson stood in front of his mirror, barely recognizing the man staring back. Gone was the tailored suit that hugged his broad shoulders, replaced by a threadbare jacket he'd dug out of a donation bin in his closet. Ironic, since he'd never worn it before. His polished loafers were swapped for scuffed sneakers, and his $10 zero-run watch stayed locked in its case. He ran a hand through his dark hair, mussing it into a tangle, and smeared a bit of dirt from a potted plant across his cheek for good measure. His heart thudded with a mix of adrenaline and dread as he grabbed an old backpack and a rusty bike from the building's storage room, one the maintenance crew used. He pedaled out into the city, the wind biting at his face, and headed west, away from the glittering downtown toward a gritty neighborhood he'd only ever seen from a helicopter. The diner was a squat, unassuming relic on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering Maggie's Place in faded pink cursive. The bell above the door jingled as Jackson stepped inside, the smell of frying bacon and burnt coffee hitting him like a warm wave. The place was a time capsule: checkered linoleum floors, red vinyl stools patched with duct tape, a jukebox humming faintly in the corner. He slid onto a stool at the counter, his stomach twisting with nerves. He'd never felt so exposed, so stripped bare, and yet there was a strange thrill in it. One in the Sursa, a young woman approached, her apron stained with grease and her chestnut hair pulled into a messy bun. Her name tag read Lila, and her hazel eyes sparkled with a quiet, unguarded kindness that caught him off guard. "Hey, who need to show one? Welcome to Maggie's," she said, her voice soft but bright, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "What can I get you?" Jackson glanced at the laminated menu, its edges curling, and his stomach rumbled louder than he'd expected. "Just a coffee," he muttered, keeping his head low, his voice rougher than usual. Lila nodded and turned away, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the floor. She returned moments later with a chipped mug steaming with black coffee, setting it down with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Here you go. Holler if you need anything." "Okay." Jackson wrapped his hands around the mug, the heat seeping into his palms as he watched her move through the diner. She chatted with a grizzled trucker, her laugh ringing out like a bell when he cracked a joke. She knelt to wipe a toddler's sticky hands, her patience unwavering as the kid squirmed. When an old man in a worn coat shuffled in, she slipped an extra biscuit onto his plate with a wink, whispering, "Don't tell Maggie." There was no calculation in her movements, no hint of judgment in her gaze. She treated everyone the same, gruff or gentle, ragged or neat, like they mattered just because they were there. Jackson's chest tightened, a flicker of something unfamiliar stirring inside him. Hope, maybe, or shame. He couldn't tell. When Lila swung by to refill his coffee, he decided to push further. He looked up, letting his eyes meet hers, and forced a tremble into his voice. Um, I don't have any money, he said, his throat dry despite the coffee. Lost my job a while back. Been sleeping wherever I can. I needed something warm. It wasn't hard to fake the desperation. He'd felt it before. In boardrooms and empty penthouses, just dressed up differently. Lila's face softened, her brows knitting together in concern. Oh, Win Hunda Wernan the Monum. Her sweetheart, don't you worry about it. She said, resting a hand lightly on the counter near his. This one's on me. He blinked, stunned. You sure weren't, madam. I don't want to get you in trouble. She waved him off with a grin. Trouble, Westermeer. Please, Hanasha Siminisur. Everyone deserves a break sometimes, especially when life's kicking you around. You sit tight. Before he could argue, she vanished into the kitchen, leaving him staring at the steam curling off his coffee. His hands shook slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of her words. When she came back, she set a plate in front of him, a grilled cheese sandwich, golden and oozing, with a heap of fries and a slice of apple pie. Eat up, she said firmly, like a big sister who wouldn't take no for an answer. You look like you could use it. Jackson stared at the food, his throat closing up. I can't, thank you. He managed, his voice cracking. She just smiled again, softer this time, and went back to her work. He ate slowly, each bite tasting like something he couldn't name. Gratitude, maybe, or relief. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a billionaire or power broker, but as a person and it was Lila, with her stained apron and minimum wage job, who'd done it without even knowing. The next day, he couldn't stay away. He pulled up to Maggie's in the Bentley, the engine's roar turning heads as he stepped out in a crisp suit, his hair combed back, his watch glinting in the sunlight. The diner went quiet as he walked in, the clatter of forks and chatter dying mid-breath. Lila froze behind the counter, her eyes widening as recognition hit. Jackson Reed, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded, offering a small, almost sheepish smile. Yeah, it's me. Can we talk? She sat across from him in a booth, her hands fidgeting with a napkin as he explained. I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who only want what I can give them. He said, one wishes or yurnum, his voice low but steady. I needed to know if there was still good out there. Real good. That didn't care about money or status. Lila, you showed me that yesterday. You didn't have to, but you did. Her eyes glistened, tears brimming as she shook her head. I was just doing what felt right. He slid a check across the table, $150. Nary a senior made out to her. This is for you, he said, for your kindness. Use it for whatever you've always wanted. She gasped, shoving it back. Nah, I can't. It's too much. But he leaned forward, his gaze intense. You will, you deserve it. Lili Nasoran Hanuworm, more than I ever did. Weeks later, Lila enrolled in culinary school, her dream of owning a bakery finally within reach. She still worked shifts at Maggie's, her smile as warm as ever. But now it carried a spark of something new. Possibility. Jackson, meanwhile, poured his fortune into a foundation for the city's forgotten, funding shelters and job programs with a fervor he'd once reserved for corporate takeovers. One evening, as they stood outside the diner, the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, he turned to her. You changed me. Lillian, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You showed me there's still something worth believing in. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. And you gave me a chance to be more than I thought I could. Thank you. Jackson needed someone in ons. The rain had stopped, and for the first time in a long time, the world felt bright. Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that lingered after that night outside Maggie's. It clung to him like the scent of rain on asphalt, sharp and inescapable. For years, he'd moved through life like a machine, calculated, precise. Every decision a lever to pull for maximum gain. But Lila's kindness had thrown a wrench into the gears. He found himself replaying their conversations in his head, her voice cutting through the noise of boardroom chatter and the hum of his penthouse's smart systems. It wasn't just gratitude he felt. It was something raw, messier, nanoronimons, like a crack in the armor he'd spent decades forging, and he didn't know what to do with it. The foundation became his obsession. He named it Open Hands, a nod to the way Lila had reached out to him that day at the diner. He poured millions into it, hiring a team of sharp-eyed idealists to scout the city's poorest corners, places he'd never set foot in before, where the streets were lined with crumbling brick and the air smelled of exhaust and despair. He visited the first shelter himself, a converted warehouse in Pilsen, its walls still echoing with the ghosts of its industrial past. The cots were packed tight, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. And the people, men with hollow cheeks, women clutching kids with wide, wary eyes, watched him like he was an alien stepping off a spaceship. He didn't blame them. In his tailored coat and polished shoes, he was Mr. Restaurant. We weren't expecting you, the site manager stammered. A wiry woman named Carla with a clipboard clutched to her chest. Jackson waved her off, his gaze sweeping the room. I'm not here to inspect, he said, though his tone softened when he saw her flinch. I want to see it. How it works. Carla nodded, hesitant, then led him through the chaos. Volunteers ladling soup into bowls. A nurse bandaging a man's blistered foot. Kids chasing each other around a stack of donated books. Jackson's chest tightened again. That same unfamiliar ache from the diner. These people weren't numbers on a spreadsheet or pawns in a negotiation. They were real, and they were hurting, and he'd spent his life flying over them in private jets without a second thought. Back in his penthouse that night, he stood at the window, Narush to them, the city sprawling below like a glittering chessboard. He'd always been the king, moving pieces with a flick of his wrist. Now, one. He felt like a pawn himself, small and unsteady in a game he didn't fully understand. His phone buzzed, another gala invite, another chance to sip champagne with people who'd stab him in the back for a bigger slice of his empire. He tossed it onto the couch without replying. Instead, he grabbed his coat and headed back to Maggie's. The diner was quieter this time. The lunch rush long gone. Lila was wiping down the counter, her movements quick and practiced, though her shoulders sagged with the weight of a double shift. She looked up as the bell jingled, and her face brightened when she saw him. Not the guarded smile she'd worn when he'd revealed himself, but something real, unguarded. Well, look who's back, she teased, tossing the rag into a bucket. Coffee or something stronger. Coffee's fine, he said, sliding onto his usual stool. She poured it without asking how he took it. Black. No fuss. Just like last time. He watched her hands, steady and sure, and felt a pang of something he couldn't name. How's school going? He asked, keeping his tone casual, though his pulse ticked up as he waited for her answer. Lila leaned against the counter, her eyes lighting up. It's amazing. Hard. Though I'm up half the night studying recipes and ratios, but I love it. Last week, I made a brioche that didn't collapse, and I swear I almost cried. He chuckled, the sound surprising him. Brioche. Me the farty in audience. Huh? You're gonna put this place out of business with pie that good. She laughed too, a sound that warmed the air between them. Maggie'd fire me first. She's territorial about her apple crumble. They fell into an easy rhythm, trading small talk about her classes and his latest foundation projects. But beneath it, Jackson felt the pull again, that crack widening. Letting something slip through he wasn't ready to face, he started showing up more often. Always late in the day when the diner was winding down. Sometimes he'd bring blueprints for Open Hands' next shelter, spreading them across the counter for Lila's input. She'd trace the lines with a chipped fingernail, suggesting tweaks, a bigger kitchen, more space for kids to play, her practicality grounding his grand ideas. Other times, he'd just sit and listen as she vented about a tough exam or a rude customer. Her words spilling out like she'd been holding them in too long. He liked that she didn't tiptoe around him anymore. Didn't treat him like Jackson Reed, Billionaire. It weren't a connection, for her. He was just Jackson, the guy who drank too much coffee and tipped way too much. One night, as snow dusted the streets outside, he lingered longer than usual. The diner was empty, save for an old man nursing a tea in the corner, and Lila was stacking chairs, her breath puffing out in the chilly air. Jackson stood to help, ignoring her protests, and they worked in silence for a while, the scrape of metal on linoleum the only sound. When they finished, she leaned against a booth, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "You don't have to do that, you know," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not some charity case." "I know," he replied, meeting her gaze. "I wanted to." She studied him, her hazel eyes searching his face, and he felt that crack split wider, exposing something he'd buried deep. "Why do you keep coming back here, Jackson?" she asked, not accusing, just curious. He opened his mouth, then closed it, the words tangling in his throat. "Because you're real. Because you make me feel like I could be Soder Westers." But he couldn't say it, not yet. Instead, he shrugged, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "The coffee's good," she rolled her eyes. But there was a softness there, a spark that mirrored the one flickering in his chest. "Liar," she said, and turned to lock up. He followed her out into the snow, the flakes catching in her hair like tiny stars. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The snow kept falling as Jackson and Lila stood outside Maggie's, the streetlights casting long shadows across the powdery ground. His breath puffed out in white clouds, mingling with hers. And for a moment, neither of them moved. The city hummed around them, distant horns, the low rumble of a passing bus, but it felt like they were the only two people in the world. Jackson shoved his hands into his pockets, the cold biting at his fingers, and glanced at her. Lila's cheeks were pink from the chill, her scarf slipping loose around her neck, and she was looking up at the sky, watching the flakes drift down with a quiet wonder that made his chest ache. He wanted to say something, anything, to keep her there a little longer, but the words stuck like ice in his throat. "You should get home," she said finally, breaking the silence. "It's getting late, and you've got that big meeting tomorrow, right?" "The one with the mayor." He nodded, surprised she'd remembered. He'd only mentioned it offhand last week, buried in a rant about zoning laws. "Yeah, one on Tornantumon," he said, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "But I'm not in a rush." She tilted her head, studying him again with that piercing gaze that always made him feel like she could see right through his polished exterior. "You sure, Tornantumon? You look like you're freezing." "I'm fine," he lied, though his teeth were starting to chatter. Truth was, he didn't want to leave. Not the diner. Not the snow. Not her. The penthouse waited for him, all sleek lines and sterile silence. And the thought of going back to it felt like sinking into a void. Lila raised an eyebrow, unconvinced, then tugged her scarf tighter. "Well, the one is very tinted one. I'm heading out. Gotta catch the L before it stops running. You take care." "Okay." She turned to go, her boots crunching in the snow, and panic flared in Jackson's gut. Wait," he blurted, stepping forward. She paused, glancing back over her shoulder, and he scrambled for an excuse. "Let me drive you. It's too cold to wait for the train." Lila hesitated, her lips parting as if to argue, but then a gust of wind whipped past, and she shivered hard enough to make her teeth click. "Okay," she said, a reluctant smile tugging at her mouth. "But only because I don't want to turn into a popsicle." He led her to the Bentley, a free de Washaranum, parked a block away, its black finish now dusted white. She let out a low whistle as they approached. "Fancy," she said, half teasing, half impressed. He opened the passenger door for her, and she slid in, her sneakers leaving faint snow prints on the mat. Inside, the car was a cocoon of warmth, the leather seats heating up as he started the engine. Lila rubbed her hands together, blowing on them, and he cranked the heat higher without a word. "Where'd?" he asked, pulling onto the street. She gave him an address in Humboldt Park, a neighborhood he only knew from news headlines, gritty, tight-knit, worlds away from his Gold Coast fortress. The drive was quiet at first, the soft hum of the engine filling the space between them. Snowflakes battered the windshield, melting into streaks under the wipers, and Jackson kept his eyes on the road. Though his mind was racing, he wanted to ask her 1,000 things. Why she was so kind, what she dreamed of beyond the bakery, what kept her going in a life that clearly wasn't easy. But every question felt too big, too clumsy for the fragile thing growing between them. Finally, Lila broke the silence. "So, what's it like?" she asked, her voice cutting through the hush. "Being you. I mean, all that money, all those people watching." He gripped the wheel tighter, his jaw flexing. "It's loud." he said after a beat. Even when it's quiet. Everyone's got an angle, and you're always waiting for the knife. She turned to look at him, her profile sharp against the glow of the dashboard. That sounds lonely, she said, not pitying, just stating a fact. He swallowed hard, the truth of it sinking into his bones. Eva weren't Karasu. It is. They didn't speak again until he pulled up to her building. A faded red brick walk-up with a flickering porch light. The street was narrow, lined with cars half buried in snow, and a group of kids darted past, laughing as they lobbed snowballs at each other. Lila unbuckled her seatbelt but didn't move to get out, her fingers lingering on the strap. Thanks for the ride, she said, her voice softer now. You didn't have to. He met her eyes, and that crack in his chest split wider still. I wanted to, he said again, echoing his words from the diner. And this time, they carried a weight he couldn't hide. She nodded, like she understood something he hadn't said aloud. And then she was gone, disappearing into the building with a quick wave. Jackson sat there for a long minute, the engine idling, watching the snow pile up on the hood. His hands were still cold, but his chest was warm, alive with a feeling he hadn't known he could still have. He drove home in a daze, the city blurring past. And when he stepped into his penthouse, it didn't feel as empty as before. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Open Hands opened 2 more shelters, and Jackson threw himself into the work, meeting with architects and donors, cutting ribbons with a smile that wasn't just for the cameras. But every evening, he found himself back at Maggie's, drawn like a moth to a flame. Lila started saving him a slice of pie, apple. Always apple, joking that it was billionaire bait. He'd laugh, and she'd roll her eyes. And they'd talk until the diner emptied out. He learned she'd grown up in that same Humboldt Park walk-up, raised by a single mom who'd worked 3 jobs to keep the lights on. She told him about the bakery she wanted, not some fancy downtown spot, but a little place in her neighborhood, where kids could get free cookies and old folks could sit with their coffee all day if they wanted. He told her about his dad, a cold, driven man who'd built Reed Innovations from nothing and left Jackson with a legacy of ambition but no warmth. They traded pieces of themselves, small at first, then bigger, one-ish, until it felt like they'd built something neither could name. One night, as spring crept in and the snow turned to slush, he arrived at Maggie's to find her waiting outside, her apron off, a nervous energy in her stance. I've got something to show you, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He followed her to a storefront 2 blocks away, its windows papered over, a for lease sign still dangling crookedly in the door. I did it, she said, turning to him with a grin that lit up the dark. I signed the lease today. It's gonna be mine, the bakery. I used your check and some savings. And God, it's real. He stared at her, then at the empty shop, and something broke open inside him. Pride, joy, a rush of heat that made his eyes sting. Lila, he said, stepping closer. That's, you're incredible. She laughed, a little shaky, and then she hugged him, her arms tight around his neck. He froze for a split second, then wrapped his arms around her, breathing in the faint scent of cinnamon and coffee that clung to her hair. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining, and he knew he was done hiding. I'm not good at this, he said, his voice raw. But you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. Her breath caught, and then she smiled, slow and sure. You're not so bad yourself, she whispered. And when she kissed him, the world fell away. The kiss lingered in the cool spring air, a tentative spark that flared into something steady and undeniable. Jackson felt it in his bones, a warmth that spread from where Lila's lips pressed against his, chasing away the chill that had settled into him years ago. Her hands rested lightly on his chest, her fingers curling into the fabric of his coat, and he held her close, one hand at the small of her back, the other brushing against her cheek. When they finally pulled apart, her hazel eyes locked onto his, wide and searching, and a nervous laugh bubbled out of her. Well, she said, her voice shaky but bright. That's one way to christen the place. Jackson grinned, a real grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Something he hadn't felt in ages. Better than a ribbon cutting, he said, and she swatted his arm, her cheeks flushing pink. They stood there for a moment, the empty storefront looming behind them, its papered windows hiding a future she'd fought to claim. He could see it in her face, the mix of pride and fear, the weight of a dream teetering on the edge of reality. You're really doing this. She's arrived. he said, more to himself than to her, his voice thick with awe. She nodded, biting her lip. Yeah, soon. I am me and am wonderful nonsense. And it's terrifying. He wanted to tell her she didn't have to be scared, that he'd make sure it worked, throw money at it, hire the best contractors, pull every string he had. But he stopped himself. This was hers, not his to fix or control. And the last thing she needed was him bulldozing in like he did with everything else. Instead, he squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing a slow circle over her knuckles. You've got this Sirwinde Wecken in homage, Lily, Siriyalvirma, and I've got your back. Her smile softened, gratitude flickering in her eyes, and she squeezed back. I know you do. They walked back to Maggie's together, the night wrapping around them like a blanket. The diner's neon sign buzzed faintly, a beacon in the dim street, and Jackson felt a pull he couldn't shake. This place, this woman, they'd become his anchor, tethering him to something solid when his life had always been a storm. Inside, Lila grabbed a couple of coffees, and they sat in a booth, the vinyl creaking under their weight. She kicked off her sneakers, tucking her feet under her, and he loosened his tie, letting the day's tension unravel. So, on a church, she said, sipping her coffee. What's next for the great Jackson Reed? Another shelter. A skyscraper with your name on it. He leaned back, swirling the coffee in his mug. More shelters? Yeah. But I'm thinking bigger, job training, maybe a scholarship fund, something that doesn't just patch things up but changes them. He paused, glancing at her. You inspired that. You know, Kishore Wakinam. That day you gave me the sandwich. I realized I'd been coasting, not really doing anything that mattered. Lila's eyebrows shot up, surprise flashing across her face. Me and Marie. I just fed you. You're the one turning it into a revolution. It's not a revolution, he said, though her words sent a jolt through him. It's just waking up. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his, and the contact sparked something electric. Well, I like you awake, she said, her voice low, and he felt that crack in his chest heal over, replaced by something stronger. The bakery took shape over the next few months, a whirlwind of sawdust and paint fumes. Lila named it Cinnamon and Hope, a nod to her favorite spice and the feeling that had carried her through. Jackson was there every chance he got, hauling bags of flour when the delivery guy flaked, sanding down the counter she'd found at a flea market, even burning his fingers trying to help her test the ovens. She'd laughed at that, kissing his blistered thumb with a tenderness that made his heart stutter. He didn't belong in a kitchen. He was all thumbs with a spatula, but he belonged with her, and that was enough. The grand opening came on a crisp June morning, the sun glinting off the freshly painted sign. The shop was small but alive, its brick walls lined with shelves of bread and pastries. A chalkboard menu scrawled with Lila's loopy handwriting. Kids from the neighborhood pressed their noses to the glass, lured by the smell of cinnamon rolls, and old folks shuffled in with canes and smiles. Jackson stood by the door, handing out free cookies like she'd asked, though he felt faintly ridiculous in an apron that read, "Don't burn it." Lila moved through the crowd, her apron dusted with flour, her laugh ringing out as she hugged her mom, a wiry woman with Lila's eyes, who'd cried when she saw the place. By noon, the line stretched down the block, and Jackson caught Lila behind the counter, her hands trembling as she boxed up a dozen muffins. It's too much, she whispered, her voice fraying at the edges. What if I can't keep up? He stepped closer, blocking her from the chaos for a moment, and tipped her chin up. You're doing it already. Look around, they're here for you. She took a shaky breath, then nodded, and he kissed her forehead, quick and steadying, before letting her dive back in. That night, after the last customer left and the lights dimmed, they sat on the floor behind the counter, sharing a leftover cinnamon roll. Her head rested on his shoulder, her hair tickling his neck, and he felt a peace he hadn't known he could find. I couldn't have done this without you, she murmured, her voice heavy with exhaustion and something deeper. He turned to look at her, her face soft in the shadows, and his heart thudded hard enough to hurt. Yeah, you could have, he said, but I'm damn glad you didn't. She lifted her head, her eyes meeting his, and the air shifted, charged with a quiet intensity. Jackson, she started, then stopped, like she was weighing something heavy. He waited, his pulse racing, and then she leaned in, kissing him with a fierceness that stole his breath. It wasn't tentative this time. It was a claim, a promise, and he kissed her back just as hard, his hands tangling in her hair. When they broke apart, gasping, she laughed, a wild, free sound. "Guess we're in this now," she said, and he grinned. "I'm dizzy with it. Guess we are." Open hands grew alongside Cinnamon and Hope, a twin heartbeat in the city. Jackson funded a trade school in Humboldt Park, a stone's throw from Lila's bakery, where people could learn carpentry, coding, wassertism, cooking, skills to build a life, not just scrape by. He brought Lila in to teach baking classes, and she shone there, her patience and warmth turning ex-cons and single moms into pastry wizards. They'd lie awake at night in her tiny apartment or his sprawling penthouse, dreaming up plans, her expanding the bakery, him pushing the foundation nationwide. It wasn't perfect. There were fights, late nights, moments when the weight of their worlds clashed, but it was theirs. One evening, as summer faded into fall, they stood outside the bakery, the air crisp with the promise of change. He pulled her close, her back against his chest, and whispered into her hair, "You saved me, Lily Army Nerimason. I was lost until you." She turned in his arms, her eyes fierce and bright. "We saved each other," she said, and he knew it was true. The fall leaves swirled around Jackson and Lila as they stood outside Cinnamon and Hope, the bakery's warm light spilling onto the sidewalk like a golden halo. The air was sharp with the scent of wood smoke and cinnamon, a perfect blend of the season and her world. His arms tightened around her, her body fitting against his like a puzzle piece he'd never known was missing. And for a moment, they just breathed together, the city fading into a soft hum. Her words, "We saved each other," echoed in his mind, a truth that settled deep into his core. He'd spent his life chasing power, building walls, but with her, for men, he'd found something better. A, a home. A year later, the bakery had become a neighborhood institution. The line for Lila's cinnamon rolls stretched around the block every Saturday, and the walls were plastered with thank you notes from kids who'd gotten free snacks and seniors who'd found a place to belong. She'd hired 2 locals to help, Maria, a single mom with a knack for bread, and Jamal, a quiet teen who'd learned frosting swirls like an art form. Jackson watched it all, with a pride that burned brighter than any corporate victory. He still ran Reed Innovations, but it was different now. Less about conquest, more about legacy. Open Hands had spread to 5 cities, its shelters and trade schools a lifeline for thousands. And he'd named Lila as an honorary board member, her voice shaping every move. One crisp October evening, he asked her to meet him at the trade school after hours. She arrived in her flour-dusted jeans, her hair in a messy bun, expecting another late-night planning session. Instead, she found the classroom empty, save for a single table lit by candles, a spread of her own pastries laid out beside a bottle of wine. Jackson stood there, nervous in a way he hadn't been since their first kiss, his hands shoved into his pockets to hide the tremble. "What's this, she asked, her eyes narrowing with a playful suspicion that made his stomach flip. He took a deep breath, stepping closer. "Lila, I've spent my life building things, companies, towers, plans. But nothing's ever felt as real as what we've got. You turned me inside out, made me better, and I don't want to do any of it without you." Her breath hitched as he dropped to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. The ring inside was simple, a single diamond set in rose gold. Nothing flashy, just like her. "Marry me," he said, his voice raw and steady. "Because I love you more than I know how to say." Her hands flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. And for a heartbeat, he thought she might say no, not because she didn't feel it, but because she'd never been one for grand gestures. Then she laughed, a choked, joyful sound, and yanked him up to his feet. "Yes, you idiot," she said, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes, Sir Minister everyone. Yes, Sirida was her before. Yes, He kissed her hard, the taste of salt and sugar mingling on their lips. And when they pulled back, she was grinning through her tears. "But you're baking the wedding cake," she teased. And he laughed, the sound echoing off the walls. They married in the spring, in the bakery's tiny backyard, surrounded by wildflowers and the people they'd come to call family. Her mom, the diner crew, the trade school graduates who'd become their friends. Lila wore a simple white dress, her hair loose and wild, and Jackson traded his suits for a linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up. The cake was a joint effort, her recipe. His clumsy hands, and it leaned a little to the left. But no one cared. They danced under string lights to a jukebox tune, her head on his chest, his heart beating in time with hers. Years later, Cinnamon and Hope had a second location, and Open Hands was a national name. They had a daughter, Hazel, with Lila's eyes and Jackson's stubborn streak, who'd toddle around the bakery leaving sticky handprints on everything. Jackson would scoop her up, flour on his tie, and Lila would watch them, her smile a quiet marvel. They'd built a life, not perfect, but theirs, stitched together with kindness, grit, perseverance, and a love that had started with a cup of coffee and a lie. One quiet night, as Hazel slept upstairs and the bakery hummed with the last of the day's warmth, Jackson found Lila at the counter, sketching plans for a third shop. He slid behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. Still dreaming big, he murmured, kissing her neck. She leaned into him, her pencil pausing. Always, she said, turning to meet his gaze. You. He looked at her, at the woman who'd pulled him out of the dark, who'd given him a reason to believe, and smiled. Every damn day, he said, and kissed her slow and deep. The world outside fading to nothing. They'd started as strangers, one rich, one poor, but together, they'd found something priceless. Each other, worse than on Pinathan. And that, they knew, was the sweetest thing of all.